or welcome to my channel. My name is Ren and I make videos a couple of times a week about books and pop culture, and today we are doing another video diving into dark romance as a genre because I have even more things to say. I've spoken about dark romance before. I spoke about it as a genre and how I don't think it's something that should be called romance, and kind of delved into it, but a few things that I've been thinking about recently and a few conversations that I've had with friends IRL, I wanted to make another video and follow up on that one and talk a little bit more about why I don't think it should be called dark romance. The definition of dark romance has been twisted a little bit, and now things are being called dark romance when they shouldn't be. Definitely the content that's in dark romance books has evolved greatly, and there's lots of different things and lots of different components, so I want to talk about that. But before we get into that, if you're new here, hello, welcome. If you want to join us, feel free to subscribe. I'm also launching a book club this year. I'll link below the Fable page for it and also the coffee, and the coffee is like, if you donate, you get choices of voting for what book and everything. And all, of course, all my other social medias are also in the description, as well as my bookish podcast. So dark romance. Dark romance is something which before Book Talk was spoken about, but I think was spoken about in a very different way and also had very different context and content. Things like 50 Shades of Grey was dark romance. Now, dark romance encapsulates a lot of different things, and there's a lot of different elements to dark romance, and it worries me that we're still using the term romance. That's where I feel like the issue lies. I want to preface this by saying that there is absolutely nothing wrong with wanting to read this content. If you're reading a book and it has this type of content in it, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. The issue, I think, is the marketing of it, and I also think the issue is hugely like the way that people speak about it. We do have a level of responsibility when talking about it to provide the correct trigger warnings and acknowledgement of what we're reading. Inspiration for this video sparked because I saw a tweet by @AngelLiterature who said, genuine question, at what point does it stop being romance and start being horror? Because if this is supposed to entice me to read this book, I'd expect a horror thriller and not a romance. I mean, do people actually want to see forced pregnancy in a supposed love story? It was two pictures of the trigger warnings in the front of Breaking Rosalind by Gigi Six. I didn't know anything about this book. I had seen it on TikTok, but it didn't look like a book that I'd be interested in. And I also am not someone that wants to hate read books. Like, if it's a book I'm not interested in, I'm not going to read it. I'll just let other people read it and that's fine. Like, I don't understand wasting time on something that I know I'm not going to like. So I haven't read the book, I'll preface that. But the trigger warnings, so some of them were like kinky, like kinks, right? So stuff that you would do in the bedroom that you may have interest in. That's absolutely fine. You do you. That's okay. But then there's other stuff which is quite crazy, right? So there's stuff in here that I was like, this is in, some of this stuff is in Stephen King books as horror. And this book isn't being marketed as horror. Right? People are talking about this book like it's romantic. And that's where I think the problem is, right? And I think that the way that books are spoken about on Book Talk has changed a lot of different things. These books are promoted and they have got some really explicit stuff in it. These books have got stuff in that, like I said, is in Stephen King books as horror, right? As something that you couldn't conceive that someone would do to another person. And yet this is literally romance. This is advertised as romance and spoken about online as romance. And I don't think it should be. I think we need to get romance out of the title. Like, I think for 50 Shades of Grey, I think it would be considered romance as well. It is a bit of a darker romance, I understand that. But books with this type of content, this isn't romantic. It might have a love story in it, but it's not a healthy one. And it freaks me out that young people are being exposed to this, right? There doesn't seem to be a filter. People aren't saying what is in these books. Books are being recommended, and they are being recommended to really young people. Scary to think that they would be reading this and not knowing what they were going to read, but also then not knowing like that it's wrong. And I think that's where this issue comes into it, right? There's nothing wrong with reading this stuff, and there's nothing wrong with reading smut. There's nothing wrong with reading books that have darker themes, and none of those things are wrong. I literally have an entire like Stephen King section. Like, I read these books. I love horror. I love reading things like that. There's nothing wrong with reading those things. But I think that you have to have the understanding of what those things mean. And this is where I get concerned. I've seen so many people, so many young teenagers in bookstores leaving with books that they probably shouldn't be reading. When I was a bookseller, I had to tell a parent that her 12-year-old son probably shouldn't have been reading A Court of Thorns and Roses because she came in looking for the second book because he'd finished the first one. And I was like, oh my God. I was like, do you know the content of these books? And she was like, no. And she was mortified, right? But she was like, I don't read. So, you know, he just asked me for these books that he's seen online, and that was in the days of BookTube, you know. And I mean, BookTube's still a thing, but the BookTok, there's so much more scope and there's so much more reach. I've said this before as well, but like bookstores are doing like BookTok tables, so people are like, oh, that was on BookTok, but there's no filter. Like, some of these books should be in an adult fiction section, but they're on a table at the front of the store where anyone can see them and pick them up and not know what's inside them. And I think if you've got young people, young kids picking up these books and they're seeing online favorite creators or people that they like to watch saying that these books are romantic and people really loving the love interest in these books, they're then going to read them and think that they're romantic, and actually it's a really unhealthy dynamic. And then it sort of sets this precedent of what romance is, what constitutes as romance, and what we should be looking for in relationships. And that's where I get worried. Like I said, there's nothing wrong with the content and there's nothing wrong with people reading it. That's not the issue, and I don't want anyone to think that I'm shaming for what you read. That's not the problem. The problem is the way that it's then marketed and spoken about, because I feel like that can then have a detrimental impact. And I think that part is what gets lost in translation. Like, I wouldn't recommend a Stephen King book and not talk about what was in it. Like, if a friend said to me, oh, what Stephen King books have you read? I'd be like, this one's my favourite, but here's this like list of what's in this book as preparation for reading it. Whereas that doesn't seem to be happening when these romance books are being spoken about, right? Which is where I find issue with this, is like, that this doesn't seem to be spoken about. Obviously, I saw the list of trigger warnings in the front of the book, and it's very good that this book has them. And I think that it was good to make people aware of what was in it. And I think that all books should have that. And I think that it should be seen as something which you do need to prepare someone for, and not just a normal part of romance. And I think as adults, you can understand that not all of this book is romantic, and there's elements that are concerning and elements that you wouldn't look for in a real relationship. But when you're younger, you're not fully aware of that. Like, I was a huge Twilight fan when I was younger, and I didn't actually, like, until I was a lot older, fully understand the like toxicity of Edward and Bella's relationship, and like Edward in general. And there's a lot in those books that I just like was just not aware of, because my brain just didn't think about that. My brain just wasn't thinking that way. And I think that that's part of the issue, is like, when does this become horror? And I would argue that the Breaking Rosalind series is horror. I wouldn't say that this is dark romance. I would say this is a horror book, or a crime book at the least. There needs to be a lot more conversation around it, and I think there needs to be this wider understanding of what is considered unhealthy and what is the reality. And I think that there's going to be a lot of young people reading these books and thinking that this is romance, this is the blueprint for romance, this is what relationships should be, and these things happen in relationships, whereas actually this is something which is unhealthy and shouldn't be happening in relationship. And like I said, there's nothing wrong with reading the content. I don't want to shame anyone. That's absolutely fine. If you want to read these books, go ahead. Like I said, I have read much worse, I think, and that's not the issue. I think the issue is just in the way that it's spoken about and the way that it's talked about. And I think that publishers have a huge responsibility for this as well. I do think there should be trigger warnings in books, and I also think that covers should not be misleading when there's books that are made to look more aesthetically pleasing, but actually they're quite brutal. I feel like the book should not look all like cutesy and romantic when that's not the case. The publishers need to, the way that they talk about things on social media as well, I think there needs to be more communication surrounding it, and more, and like changes in the way that the genres are categorized and what is included in a specific genre. Like I said, I think that BookTok has changed, definitely changed the definition of dark romance, but actually I think that there needs to be, it needs to be a lot more like rigid. I think there needs to just be more like regulation. Again, it's not the content, it's how the content is being presented, and I think that's the issue, and I think that's what is not necessarily being spoken about. And I do just think, like, when does it become horror? Where do we draw that line? You know, could we pick up a Stephen King book and just say it's dark romance? Like, I think one of the scenes in like Hunting, Adeline, my friend said, because I haven't read Hunting, I read Haunting, is like really similar to a scene that happens in The Stand by Stephen King, but no one would pick The Stand up and say that's dark romance. And I think that that's where the issue lies, is when does it become, how do we categorize it, and that we need to probably be doing better when we do categorize it. And I think that it starts from the publisher, it starts from all of these things, but I think it also starts, and we have a responsibility as creators to talk about what's in these books and to talk about the unhealthiness of that and what that means, and how we go about ensuring that people are fully aware of what they're reading and understand the context as well, and know that this isn't this like love story that's a bit darker, and that this is actually like violence. But yeah, I've been having a talk with some of my friends recently about when does it become horror, and obviously I saw that tweet as well, and I just thought it was a really interesting conversation, because where do we draw that line? And I think that line is crossed very often, and we don't acknowledge that it's crossed. I think part of TikTok being so quick is that things aren't included, and there's definitely, and again I've said this before as well, but the access to books is so quick. It's like, oh, you can click this link and there's the book and you can buy it instantly, and kind of the vetting of the book just goes down and down and down, and the conversations surrounding the content goes down and down and down, because it's all so quick now and the exposure is so broad, that I think that is becoming a little bit of a problem, and I think it is something that we should be talking about. So yeah, I'd love to know your thoughts on this. Leave them in the comments, we'll have a conversation about it. Again, please don't think that I'm shaming anyone for what they want to read. I just think it's how we talk about it that needs to kind of be improved upon. Like I said before, if you guys are new here, I make videos a couple of times a week about books and pop culture, so if you want to stick around and join us, feel free to hit that subscribe button and the little notification bell. And as usual, all the links to my other social medias and my bookish podcast will be in the description as well. I hope you guys are doing really, 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 really well, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.